Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. So I notice on the wall you have a framed page of George Herriman's Krazy Kat, and anybody who reads Krazy Kat or who has read Krazy Kat can't help but fixate on something like that. How would you describe the comedic sensibility of that comic strip?
Have you ever read anything by Ring Lardner?
I have. I don't know if the listeners will have, though. I'm trying to think
of an entry point. He was one of the Algonquin Round Table, and he was also really innovative with language. He would sort of write in dialect, at first it's a slog to read, but then you kind of get to be on his wavelength, and you see he has his own language and he has his own vocabulary that he goes back to again and again, and it's hard to sort of mine comedy out of that jumble. But when you finally get Krazy Kat, it makes you laugh. It's actually really funny, and the language is very antiquated and weird, and some of it is just his own invention. But once it finally clicks, you feel like it's one of those stereogram paintings where if you stare at it the right way, it turns into 3D. Like I didn't like Krazy Kat at first, but when it clicked with me, I started buying up all the books, and the only tattoo I've ever considered getting was Ignatz tossing a brick at Krazy, and I haven't gotten it yet, but maybe someday.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down in Atwater Village with Scott Jacobson. Now, Scott is a comedy writer. He's put his stamp on many a production, including The Daily Show, including Squidbillies, including the Academy Awards, including Bob's Burgers right now. You can see that animated show airing. And he's done more as well, but let me just stay on Krazy Kat for a second. Do you think there's still room in the comedic world for something with as much of a hump in front of it as Krazy Kat has, like that wall you have to get over before you can even laugh at it?
I think there is. It would not be popular in a mainstream way. I think that Adult Swim does a lot of stuff like that, like Tim and Eric. If you've ever seen their show, or they have a movie out now too, that you should probably start with the show. The movie is for maybe super fans, but they might disagree with me, but they have a very insane, over the top kind of damaged. A lot of the stuff they do kind of looks like video glitches. That it looks like the TV you're watching it on is screwed up. They make a virtue out of just crappy production values and stuff that you might find on a low budget commercial late at night on local television. And you have to kind of see past all the layers of grime that they put on their own work in order to get the comedy sometimes. And a lot of stuff on Adult Swim is like that, but most of the time things have to be immediate. Especially if you work on, like for Bob's Burgers, the critical response to a pilot can be so crushing that it can ruin a show's chances of going anywhere. So you have to try to hook people immediately, and people are predisposed to dislike comedy. At least if a new comedy comes on the air, I think people want to hate it more so than they would a dramatic show, because there's something about comedy where people want to be impressed. They feel they have that attitude, like, make me laugh, like I could do better than this.
Or you've promised you'll make me laugh, and that kind of poisons it.
I think so, yeah. And the problem is that it takes time for a show to kind of worm its way into your consciousness. Just like it shouldn't take as long as Krazy Kat, but you have to learn to love the characters. You have to understand the setting, and you have to kind of get the sensibility of the people who make it. And you're not always going to get that after the pilot. Pilots are notoriously crummy because they just try to do all of that at once. And if you're sort of in the bigger leagues of TV or movies, that's always the object. It's always to try to hook people as quickly as possible. If you're making the nice thing about working on an Adult Swim show is that the budgets are small. and so they're not really risking a whole lot, and they can just round up writers or performers who they are fans of and give them a chance to do whatever they want within reason, and just hope that translates. And if it doesn't, they haven't lost a whole lot. Like Fox can't really do that. Bob's Burgers is on Fox. Everything is just very carefully vetted and very carefully thought through, and they still have hits and misses, but they try to hedge their bets as much as they can.
What does it say to you about the media world we now watch stuff in, and the one you work in, that not only can a Tim and Eric or an Adult Swim exist, though, that they can actually thrive? Like, what does that mean? Is that... It seems like a good thing to me, but good thing doesn't say much. What is this all about?
Well, I would probably dispute that they thrive. I always, when I worked at The Daily Show...
Tim and Eric have $1 billion movie. $1 billion.
I don't know how they pulled that off, but when I was working at The Daily Show, I was just completely in awe of Adult Swim, and I didn't know anyone there. I really loved Aqua Teen Hunger Force. That was kind of my favorite. And... it just seemed like they had the best job ever, and I didn't really understand the economics of it. I got to know Dave Willis, one of the co-creators of Squidbillies, and Aqua Teen Hunger Force and Squidbillies, and I've written with him and for him, and I see that it's just as frustrating for him as it would be for any struggling writer on a show, because there's a glass ceiling to what he can do. He has fans, and the fans that he has are really rabid, but it's always going to be a niche audience. And when he goes to meetings at major networks, they're always sort of taking what he's saying with a grain of salt, unfortunately, because they know that he has been incredibly successful, but it's been an Adult Swim, and that's a smaller audience. And so Tim and Eric, I think, they're heroes of mine. I really love those guys. And the only time I've ever posed for a picture with someone who was on Bob's Burgers was when Tim Heidecker came through, and I was so proud of it, and I wanted to show it to. I put it up on Twitter, expecting people to give a damn. Yeah. And I told my mom that I'd met these guys, and then it dawned on me that they have no idea who Tim and Eric are, and if they did see Tim and Eric's show, they would probably really hate it. So it's the entertainment world is just sort of the stuff that sometimes inspires the most dedication, devotion, isn't necessarily the stuff that is the most successful. And the people who make that stuff, you would imagine they're heroes to you, and you would imagine that every door is open to them. They can go on to do whatever they want. But it
stand astride the world like gods.
Yeah, you would think so. I was a huge fan of Mr. Show with Bob and David, and I always think of those guys that way. And then when you hear them talk about their career, you realize, they've struggled. It's been an uphill battle ever since Mr. Show, because they have not made it in the way that I thought they did. It's just because I hold them in such high regard that I imagine they have.
Now, I imagine when you tell somebody that, certain people, you say, hey, I did this bit of work with Tim of Tim and Eric, they freak out. Some people you say, I worked on Squidbillies, they freak out. Some people you say, I work on Bob's Burgers, and they freak out. But I would imagine you say, I've worked on The Daily Show, and a lot of people, if they don't freak out, they're probably like, oh, yeah, Daily Show. Does it work that way? There's that one piece of your career that cuts across demographics with approving nods all around?
Yeah, the Daily Show has a cachet that a lot of the stuff I've worked on hasn't necessarily had, just in a sort of broader cultural way. It is a sort of thing that it was nice when I first started there to mention at parties, because you get that instantly you're vetted somehow, that he must be talented, he must be smart and funny, he must know a lot about current events because he works for the Daily Show. When I first started there, I was basically. I definitely left-leaning, definitely had liberal, general sort of liberal philosophy, but very lazy about it, basically politically apathetic. And the Daily Show sort of jump-started my political consciousness, but at the same time, I was certainly not somebody with a whole lot of political insight to share going into the Daily Show. When people assumed that I could keep up with them at a cocktail party talking about current events, a lot of the time they were wrong. Yeah, it is. It is kind of frustrating to have something that cuts across. It's good and bad to have something like that cuts across the rest of your career. It sets you up for feeling like future endeavors are failures because you get used to winning an Emmy every year. You get used to having like just that stamp of approval on everything you do. That the Daily Show fans are a whole different level of rabid because they hold up the show as this truth, and it's a heavyweight for someone like John to bear. It's nothing but a good thing for the writers. Right. It's nothing but pretty sweet for the writers, and I'm really like the second season of Bob's Burgers is coming out, and I'm super excited about it. I think the episodes are hilarious, and I think the people are going to come around to it. But still, it's not. You don't get the same reaction telling people you write for Bob's Burgers that I get. And I would be a liar to say I don't kind of miss that reaction.
This is a question I want to ask you about other projects as well, Bob's Burgers included, but with The Daily Show, whether as a viewer before or a viewer since you have worked on it, or as somebody who worked on it, what in your mind do you or did you think The Daily Show has to do this? Like, this thing is its mission. No one else does this. What is the this in the case of The Daily Show?
The Daily Show got to be really popular. I think it's sort of launched into what it is today around the time that Bush became president. And that was because and 9/11. And that was because I feel like political discourse and just cultural everything just got to be crazy. It was impossible to separate truth from fiction in some ways. Like the media was dropping the ball because they were not really keeping up their role as like stewards of. Not really. They weren't doing their job of helping people see what was the truth. It would always be a matter of showing what the far right thought and then what the far left thought, and then just letting people decide for themselves. But instead, they're getting two like spin on two different wrong ideas, and it's very difficult to sort through all of the spin and all of the rhetoric and find that little kernel of truth. And I think what John does so well is that he's just a voice of reason. And it's sobering, and it's also it's really satisfying to be able to trust someone to give just sort of a down the middle, smart and nuanced and carefully considered, but basically just pragmatic view of what's happening, and it sort of gives clarity to these incredibly messy, chaotic situations. And it was just a really great resource during that time. And people thought that the show would fall off once Bush got out of office, and it hasn't, because there's always a need for that. And the more, it probably wouldn't do either of us much good for me to talk about the 24-hour news cycle or blogs and the internet and how it's kind of warped the way that we see the news, because John does that in every interview, and he does it so much better. But I don't know if somebody like John was even as necessary until the last 10 or 15 years, when the internet was sort of becoming the main way that people got their news, and everything just kind of exploded.
Now, whether in media or whether you're just having a politically oriented conversation, it's pretty hard to present oneself or to present something or to even accept something presented as the voice of reason, isn't it?
It is, and you have to buy into the idea that John is the voice of reason for him to be the voice of reason. That's the this goes back to an earlier point too, and that the Daily Show is popular, but it's not Jay Leno popular. It's found its niche, and it's a bigger niche than Adult Swim, and it's certainly a niche that in the Venn diagram it overlaps with like the vast majority of the people who work at magazines and on TV. But it doesn't mean that he speaks for the majority. It's just I think it was a satisfying way for people who were on the left and sort of out of power during the Bush years and felt completely helpless. And the person who had the megaphone and had the bully pulpit was saying things that no one in the Daily Show's audience agreed with. It was nice to have someone who just seemed to to confirm that they weren't crazy, and that that they were right in thinking that things were kind of messed up.
Right. Now, tell me what the Daily Show. I mean, I don't want to stay on it too long, but I want to get it in the context here of that. When you were working then as a comedy writer in New York, that has to rank pretty high as a New York comedy writing job. Like, that's got to be kind of almost as high as you can go in New York, right? So many comedy writers come out to Los Angeles. The Daily Show's got to be pretty close to maxing out the comedy writing one can do in New York, or no?
Maybe, yeah. I think that there might be some sort of hierarchy. The thing is, the Daily Show was also a very insular place to work, and so we didn't really get to mix too much with people at other shows, and you didn't feel like you were at the king of the hill in any way. And I would probably argue that writing for Saturday Night Live is a hipper job. You're going to parties more, and you're probably living the sort of glamorous life that people imagine that a Daily Show writer or somebody at that sort of level of media or comedy might live. Like my life didn't change drastically, and I would say the same was true probably for most of the writers there.
And we talked a little off mic before about the way when someone's coming up in New York, they crest the hill, almost as they get a foothold in New York, and it becomes a really cool place for them. The Daily Show was where that happened for you?
Definitely. I was teaching kindergarten when I got hired with my writing partner at the time, Rich Blomquist, who's still there. And I had almost given up on trying to do comedy, and I had written a little bit with Rich for Rob Smigel for his Saturday TV Funhouse cartoons that they used to do on Saturday Night Live. And that was a little bit of success, but I couldn't find a way to turn it into anything else. And I took a full-time job at this private school teaching kindergarten, and I thought maybe I'm just going to transition to this, and that's when it finally happened. And a year or two into The Daily Show, I felt like I had made it. And it's a short-sighted way to think. It's definitely like a 24-year-old's way of thinking, that like you forget that you have your entire career ahead of you, hopefully, and that you're going to have to stay employed for many, many years.
You pictured 60 years of coasting, like I'm rolling,
because at the time, after 2 years of The Daily Show, I thought, sure, I could hitch my wagon to Jon Stewart and just ride this train forever. But then you realize after 5 years, I definitely needed to do something different. Mm-hmm. And I sold a pilot to Adult Swim, and I knew that it wasn't a golden ticket out, but like it got me thinking about life after The Daily Show.
Right.
2 years in, though, I loved New York. I thought that I had made it, and that I was going to be a fixture in New York comedy for the rest of my life.
Well, tell me what it is about that city, because I've interviewed other people who made the New York to Los Angeles move, some easier than others. What is it about New York City that convinces you do not want to and will never leave it, probably?
I think you feel like it's a personal failing if you don't love New York. Because everyone is constantly suffering in New York and constantly saying, I love New York. I will never leave here. LA sucks. Everywhere else sucks. You can't leave New York. And so you convince yourself that you love New York. And I really thought I would never leave. I would try to find any excuse to stay. And then when I finally tried LA, when I thought seriously about living here, and I drove my car around, I took day trips, I hiked, I realized there are a lot of things that frustrated me about New York that didn't feel like home. I would whenever I go back to New York, from the moment I get in a cab, I feel like a little bit claustrophobic, and I always have. I would feel like anxious. Whereas like coming back to LA, it was the opposite feeling. And people, there is a difference in people here compared to New York, and some stereotypes are true, but
no smoke without fire.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there is plenty of fire.
There's that
smoking
literal fire as well.
Yeah, trying to pick words carefully. People I work with now, at Bob's Burgers are so laid back and we're so happy at work. I literally, like, work is the happiest part of my day because it's where we all get along. We're all constantly joking with each other in a way that it doesn't annoy me. I can definitely imagine situations where constant joking would drive me nuts. And it wasn't that way at The Daily Show. It's just that I think I felt maybe more under the gun, maybe the pressure. It was a different sort of pressure and a different sort of personality that thrives in a like a New York work environment than the sort that thrives here. I'm saying, I guess, in a really overly delicate way that I think I kind of prefer working in LA, even though I loved the experiences that I had in New York, and I kind of prefer the coworkers that I've had here sometimes, even though personalities I don't play into it. I love the people I work with at The Daily Show. It's just that I am having a lot of fun here. And
the people you knew who were still at The Daily Show probably give you a whole lot of shit about liking Los Angeles, right?
Oh, of course. I mean, I do yoga. I've actually given up on caring about that. Like, I drive a Prius around, and I come and I own 2 yoga mats, and I have blocks over there that help me do yoga poses. So it's all of this stuff is silly. And
hey, live it or live with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I have friends some of the guys from the Daily Show who would give me the hardest time are in LA now, and I see them going through the same metamorphosis, and they know they can't talk.
This just occurs to me. Tell me if you've ever met anybody with these same feelings, but part of me, I guess maybe because I grew up watching it in this early stage, but part of me still, in a strange way, misses the sort of obscure cruelty of the Craig Kilborn Daily Show.
Oh yeah.
Did you watch the show in those days, or were you
but it didn't appeal
pure
to me
Stewart?
As much.
I
think Craig. Yeah, I think that was a really eloquent way of putting what Craig Kilborn does, and he just didn't seem like a guy who I'd want to talk to, or I certainly didn't want to be humiliated by him. We're doing, what was it, 10 questions or 5 questions?
The show didn't really have it. It wasn't about politics, and I mean, it's
no,
not.
He was not interested. Yeah. I don't think in politics.
Not that it's so much about. I mean, I guess it's kind of about politics now, more of a current event show now, I guess. But when it was grasping for form, it was like a kid in middle school who doesn't quite know what he is, but he's going to lash out.
Yeah.
And the distance of watching it through a TV screen was always fascinating to me. Have you ever met anybody who was kind of into that, or are they all kind of like, yeah, we don't talk about that time?
There were a couple people when I was at The Daily Show who had worked for Craig, and it was just such a different beast. He wasn't really interested in politics, from what I understand, and he just kind of wanted to show it was going to be a show that was funny and that was going to showcase Craig Kilborn. He was coming off of Sports Center, and he was looking for a vehicle, and he decided that wasn't it. But I don't meet too many people who say they prefer the Craig Kilborn years.
I'm not saying I prefer it, but it's just like
but you missed
that darkness about it, where it was Craig Kilborn's icy stare and Lewis Black ranting for 20 straight minutes, and those clips of public access Jesus shows they would show, like it was this hell brew of stuff.
Well, I think that was one thing that the writers kind of, or at least when I was there, I'm sure they moved on since, but when I was at The Daily Show, I kind of missed doing the silly stories, and we were doing them when I first started there in 2003. By the time I left in 2008, it was a pretty hardcore news-oriented show. We were mostly doing international news. Like, even domestic stuff felt too small for us. Mm-hmm. But everybody loves the stories about a guy who dresses up as Katz, and it was so fun to write silly jokes. If we would watch headlines sometimes of the old show over the years before I started there. And they would do an entire 5-minute headline on Kiss having a new album out, and a lot of it would be like a 2-minute long Paul Stanley impression that one of the writers was doing, and it was just like it seemed like it would be so incredibly fun.
Right. Well, even though maybe you didn't get the Kiss stories, you come out of that working on that show with what sounds like to me a different political consciousness, I guess. How would you put it? You describe yourself as being kind of apathetic about politics going in, and now you can read articles you've written that have some some basis in sort of probing the red-blue state divide, that kind of thing. How do you think of the way you think about political America now?
I am not especially. I don't devote a whole lot of mental real estate to thinking about politics, because one of the things also about writing at The Daily Show, and this has been confirmed by other people who write there, and it gets to be very grating because you see that everything goes in cycles, and nothing really moves forward. You see the same people saying the same things over and over again and being handled the same way by the media, and nothing ever feels like it's progressing. And so there was a time in The Daily Show when I would read every newspaper that I could fit into my day, which would typically be 2. I'm not going to try to sound like more of a news omnivore than I was, but I would see just how much filler there was in every single issue of every single magazine and every edition of every newspaper, and you see how they kind of vamp to fill space.
The journalistic vamp.
Yeah, there's the tabloids in New York, probably 90% of the articles on a slow news day have some connection to children being harmed, because that's always going to, the eyes are always going to go to that article. And for the New York Times, you would see them vamping by, they would take an article that really could have been the nugget of information that they had in there could have been conveyed in a paragraph or 2. And it was a 20-paragraph piece. And I'm the sort of person who's like a completist when it comes to reading, where even if I don't like a book, I'll force myself to finish it.
You're in.
Yeah. But, so that's why I'm a lot of the time frustrated with news. But there are a few things that will bubble up in the political culture that fascinate me. I wrote about Glenn Beck because before he became the sort of phenomenon he seemed to have the promise of being that sort of monolithic cultural force of just weirdness. I didn't understand what he represented. I couldn't his rhetoric was just all over the place, and he was such a goofball, and I couldn't believe anyone was taking him seriously. And I was completely fascinated, and I would read everything that I could about Glenn Beck, and I wrote a little thing about it for the web, and then it was out of my system.
Right. And reading that article, I was like, oh yeah, there was a Glenn Beck. He's out of the consciousness now. It seems like
people come and go. He had his moment, and that's another thing you kind of learned. I was worried that John's moment would pass, like I said before, when Bush left office, and I was wrong, because I think that there are personalities with actual substance who belong in the public eye and whose opinions actually should be heard. And then there are people like Glenn Beck, who is just he was a product of that time and place. And then when people were done with him, they were done with him.
What is for you the most disheartening recurring element of the media cycle? Just the thing that would grind you down the most if you were still dedicated to reading the 2 newspapers a day or what have you?
I think that it's political coverage usually. I just don't. So much of watching the GOP race now. Now that the primaries are in full swing, so much of what the candidates say, you can tell they don't believe, and there's so much pandering. I think you just get really frustrated by the reality of politics, and if you're really looking closely at it, and everyone, everyone thinks they know how politics works and think, oh, these guys are all liars and crooks, and for the most part, that's true, but I think that the electorate is also really complicit in what's awful about politics. A lot of the time it feels like people are just so easily led, and they react so strongly to just very particular cues about, patriotism, and they're not really thinking through the issues in any meaningful way. And politicians have learned how to exploit that. If they don't exploit it, then they don't get very far. And I think you find yourself in this trash compactor of reality when you read a lot of political coverage that, I just wanted to crawl out of it.
Yeah, so the trash compactor of reality. Now, how much solace does writing for animation like a Squidbillies or a Bob's Burgers give you from that trash compactor?
It's wonderful. It's like writing for Bob's Burgers especially. It's just like It's a very warm show. It's just purely silly a lot of the time, but it's still smart. And it's been just a joy. And writing for Squidbillies is a different thing, where it's I'm tapping into a lot of the. I grew up in North Carolina and lived out in the country for a few years, kind of in the deep country, and I'm tapping into a lot of that. And sometimes I feel like I may be tapped out, but I love the show. And like Dave and Jim, the guys who created it and run the show, are so smart. And they actually, I'm always, it's a joy writing for that one too, just because it should not be as smart as it is. It's a show.
Listeners who don't know, by the way, it's about a family of hillbilly squids. But go on.
Yes, they live in backwoods Georgia, and for all it really should just be another blue collar TV. But they somehow make it so it's actually even kind of pretty to look at in a gross kind of Ralph Steadman way. But yeah,
the best kind of gross way for something to be is a Ralph Steadman way. I personally believe, but. Tell me, I mean, Squidbillies, I meet people who are aware of it. Bob's Burgers is pretty new. How do you describe that show to somebody at a party who maybe has heard the words Bob's Burgers but has never tuned in? Or you mentioned it's still kind of sort of getting on its feet in terms of being a new program. How do you introduce it to people?
Well, I tend to lead with the people who are in it, just because I really respect Kristen Schaal is one of my absolute favorite comic actors. I've seen her just be brilliantly funny in so many different situations and doing so many different characters. She's a big favorite of mine. And John Benjamin is just a genius at voiceover acting. And I was a huge fan of Dr. Katz when I was a kid, and to be able to work with it and that show is just. I always mention that show when I'm talking about Bob's Burgers, because I think it does something similar in that it tries to take very minimalist elements. Like, this is a family who works at a burger restaurant, and it's the opposite of high concept. But we try to make stories that are somehow emotionally relevant, that aren't just kind of strings of jokes, that actually make you kind of like the family and relate and feel for them. And Dr. Katz did that with just the most minimalist animation and just like these two really compelling characters like Jonathan Katz and John Benjamin. And I think there's some of that spirit in this show too. And I always mention that Kevin Kline's in it, even though he has a small part, just because people like Kevin Kline and it gives us an air of legitimacy.
What was the confused expression first? And then, Kevin Kline.
Yeah. And that's usually what kind of shuts them up. First, when I say Bob's Burgers, they assume that it's a children's television show and that it's on Nickelodeon or something. And I'll say, oh, John Benjamin's in it, and they don't necessarily know John. Right. Kristen Schaal, still blank looks. Then I'll say, oh, Kevin Kline's in it. And so all of a sudden, it's a real show. Right. It's something that, yeah.
You mentioned enjoying Dr. Katz as a kid. I mean, how young are you saying? Because the kids, I remember kids dividing along a certain line with Dr. Katz, most of them turning it right off as soon as it came on the air, but a hardcore of kids who would hang with it. I take it you were in the second group.
I was in the hardcore. Yeah, I loved the show from the very beginning. I think I even have... there are a few shows where I actually remember watching the premiere. I remember watching The Simpsons premiere. I was just talking about this at work.
That Christmas one where they get the day. Yeah, I remember. I tuned in too.
Yeah, it was a big... they were just coming off of like the Tracy Ullman show, so I'm not really sure why there was such a big to do. But I feel
remember it looked weird, or like the style was like, why do the people look that way? Like today, you'd never balk at the Simpsons style because it's part of our culture. But then it was like, that looks so grotesque. I've got to watch.
Yeah, maybe that was it. Maybe it was just that it looked weird, and it was also that there hadn't been a cartoon in prime time for a while, so that had that novelty factor. But yeah, I remember watching the premiere of Dr. Katz and just being hooked right away, just because I was already a fan of Woody Allen, and it reminded me of the sort of natural overlapping dialogue style that he has in like Annie Hall and Manhattan, and which were my favorites at the time. Yeah, no, just something clicked with me.
Dr. Katz used kind of a computer technology to make an animated show where you didn't have to spend $200,000 an episode to get the thing out there. And you can go on and see more examples. I'm sure even Bob's Burgers and Squidbillies don't cost what they would have cost to make 20, 30 years ago if you could do it at all. Are we ever more living in a world where animation can get where more shows can be animated, where animation can be a more interesting medium to write in because more things are possible for a niche audience, for people with not a lot of money at their disposal, but a lot of tools that this world has? I mean, it sounds like I'm just setting up yes, of course it is, but I do wonder what you think about that.
Yes, of course it is, but also there's a surprising. It's like writing for Squidbillies. A lot of the time, I would have an idea. That was the first animated show, not counting the Saturday TV Funhouse stuff that I worked on, and I thought it's animated. You can just do whatever you want. I can write as crazy a script as I want, and they would always rein me in because they would remind me that someone actually has to draw that stuff, and it is more expensive to do more. They always encourage you to write stuff that's within the sets that they have. They talk about them as sets as if they're actual places, and use your characters. And it's Bob's Burgers departs from that a lot. We have a lot of really big, crazy episodes in the second season, and that drove the animators nuts. But there are still limitations. I still think, yeah, absolutely. Though it's much, much cheaper. A lot of the stuff that Adult Swim does is done in After Effects, I believe, and that's a pretty easily accessible program that I have and that tons of people have. And Bob's Burgers still does. We still ship our episodes out to Korea, and there are giant animation mills that take. I think I heard the other day that it's only 2 weeks to animate an episode, which is shocking to me. It used to take much, much longer, 6 months. You can tell the difference in quality too. It's going to be a long time before you can have something that looks as good as like a Fox Sunday night show that was made by a guy with his computer, in a couple of weeks. So right now you can do some sort of low rent animation, but yeah.
I mentioned earlier the Crazy Cat panel you have on the wall, and I look down a little bit more and I see a collection of Carl Barks Scrooge comics, I believe, and both icons of what I have read in my childhood and since as well, because both of them have had the critical opinion about them has come around to the point where in their time of publication they were just more Scrooge comics, just more newspaper comics for Crazy Cat in the early 20th century. But now critical opinion is like, wait, these are actually masterworks. George Herriman, master. Carl Barks, the auteur of the Duck comic. Really, it's hard to overstate how respected those two are now. And tell me, I mean, do you see some sort of core of appeal in forms or sort of appearances that not that deceive, but that you can bring to a higher level than might be apparent from just a glance at them, if that wasn't too convoluted?
No, I understand what you mean. I think that now is we're living in a sort of time of critical reappraisal of low art, and it's if you look at like the AV Club, they treat every episode of every TV show like it's or some sort of Rosetta Stone to be decoded, and it's amazing if you work for one of those shows and get to read the next day after your episode airs this crazy exegesis of like everything that things that you had no intention of conveying, the guys picking up on, and their favorite quotes, and then like a long discussion in the comments section. Everything is treated the way that films used to be treated, or that high art used to be treated, and there's something to it because I think TV, just narrowing the conversation to TV versus film, where film was high art or could be high art and TV was always low art. I think that TV is such a writer-driven medium now, and characters are so much more. Now, there have been plenty of shows in the past that had three-dimensional characters, but I think so much more attention is paid to developing characters and to coming up with sophisticated storylines that don't insult the audience, especially on shows like Parks and Rec or 30 Rock. That there's no reason a smart person can't be every bit as absorbed by a season of 30 Rock that they are by a movie from Poland that they have to go to the art house to see. And people, I think they're just the only difference between, and that's kind of always been the case. There have always been like brilliant TV shows. There's always been brilliant low art. The difference now is that people are just sort of embracing it more. I feel like there's much less of a guilty pleasure factor when it comes to liking something like old Carl Barks cartoons.
Well, I'm going to pause it for a second because let me see if this makes sense to you. If this line I'll draw makes sense. I'll say there is a solid line between writing an exegesis of an episode of Whitney and appreciating Karl Barks and George Herriman. It seems like one is like, let's treat this thing like it isn't junk. And another is like, wait, this stuff actually has the craft of non-junk.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Do you see do you see the difference, but do you believe that?
The difference. I think what I'm saying is it's almost overcorrected, where you have people treating everything like it's not junk. And
it's some of it the Generation X thing gone too far.
Yeah, maybe so. Because I think one of the most satisfying things too, if you've probably written criticism, you've been a critic, is salvaging something that people thought was junk or finding something on the slush pile. I like, one thing I'm really proud of recently is there was a band named Hospitality. I direct music videos, and I wanted to find a local band when I was living in New York that was kind of up and coming and that no one had really done anything with, and just do a cheap video for them. And I couldn't really find anybody. I wasn't really interested in anyone at the time in New York. And I was listening to my iPod waiting for the subway, and this song came on. I had it on shuffle, a song I never heard before that was just from some compilation I downloaded. And it was very lo-fi, very hard to figure out who the band was or even where they came from. The girl sang with kind of a British accent. It was. I since learned she was from Brooklyn. Or actually originally Kansas City, which is even weirder. But I got in touch with them, and I stayed in touch, and all they had like to their name was this one 4-song EP that was recorded very, very lo-fi on like a 4-track, and it was really good, and it showed so much promise. I really loved it, but I also didn't think that they were capable of a whole lot more. But then they made an album, they sent it to me, and I was blown away. It was one of the best things that I had heard in a very long time, and I helped them get signed to a record label, and I'm going to see them tomorrow at the Troubadour. But I feel so much, and I did their video actually, but I feel so much, I take so much pride in having found that band. It feels like some sort of critical instinct in me that there's so much, you're wading through so much trash. You're hearing so many crappy bands. You're reading so many bad books and seeing so much bad television that when you find something that not everyone else has caught on to yet, but they should, that is genuinely, there's genuine quality there that is like the Karl Barks among all of the tons and tons of crummy, pulpy comics that were produced at the same time. It's thrilling. It's like exhilarating.
It makes you realize that, yes, discernment does exist. You might forget out of all the exegeses of Whitney going on and whatnot, but there's actually, there's a real core here.
Yeah, there's real quality, and it's not just, you get swept up in the same trends and the same, all the trend spotting and the sort of stylistic shifts that happen in criticism that will bring a lot of performers or bands or TV shows to the fore when they really don't deserve it, just because, like Glenn Beck, they're a creature of their moment. When you see something that just stands alone as quality and that it would stand the test of time, it's great. It makes criticism worthwhile. It makes working in creative arts worthwhile.
Do you see the work you do in the world of music and the work you do in the world of comedy writing as two parallel careers, or are they kind of extensions of the same core mission for you, or have you thought about it? Have they just sort of happened?
It sort of happened, and they run parallel because of when you do low budget music videos, you're really working with what few resources you have, both money wise and in terms of talent and sets, anything. And so they're really, every single music video is just an exercise, and like you're given this little lump of clay and what can you make out of it. And So a lot of the fact that if I could get dramatic actors, if I could get Liam Neeson or something, just the first day that popped in my mind, even though he would be horrible in a music video. If I could get him in a music video, I would, instead of just these people who I've worked with before. And I feel like I go back to the same well of performers again and again. And it partly is because I love those guys and respect them a lot. But just as a director, sometimes you want to spread your wings a little bit. You want to try something a little bit different with people who people wouldn't expect you to work with, and that's much harder to pull off. So it runs parallel with my comedy stuff, just because of the comedy world is what I have access to. But at the same time, it's a great outlet, and I really love it because when you work in TV, you're one voice among many, and you're used to. You're helping someone else carry out their vision, and if it's a good vision, then you have no reason to complain whatsoever. If it's an awful vision, then you just sort of you turn off the part of your brain that deals with discernment, and you just kind of do the job. But no matter what job you're doing, you're going to have a lot of ideas that you're really excited about that just kind of get shot down out of hand. And it's nice to be able to have an idea that I'm excited about and know that I can execute it myself, even if it's within these straitened circumstances of a low budget and, the same 5 people who will say yes to being in my videos for no money. It's kind of liberating in that way. And I try to do it as much as I can and as much as I can afford to, because I always end up putting money into them myself. And I work on them on weekends and after hours. And it's been a nice discovery for me that this can be an outlet, because before I started doing music videos, I didn't really do a whole lot of outside work. I was working at the Daily Show, and every once in a while I would write an article, but that's about it.
And it's a sense I get from when I do short filmmaking myself. Like when you're doing low budget music videos, every piece of cleverness you can put in there, every piece of hard craftsmanship you can do and insert into it, because of the context, that hits the audience as even more of a surprise. You know what I mean? Like the medium makes it so it's more of an effective delivery system of what you can do well, because it surprises people more. Or you think so?
I kind of think of that as like the improv rule. It's so much improv comedy you see, and I was in New York when the UCB blew up, and I have seen much more than my share of improv comedy. So much of it, when you take it out of the context of an improv performance, is not nearly as funny. And a lot of it is because the audience meets the performance halfway, because there's that tension. Can they pull this off? They're making it all up. Music video directors or people who work with low budgets can sometimes get a lot more credit than they deserve, just for pulling off some small idea in a clever or elegant way, where it works to your advantage every time. Yeah.
And contributing to a show like Squidbillies about hillbilly squids, I mean, is there a sense like this is something we've set up to seem so ridiculous that we can do a lot of non-ridiculous, genuine things in here, and it sort of smuggles it into the viewer's consciousness in a sense, like maybe a little grand, but the context makes it seem so strange that the contents can be, it gives you maybe more freedom or maybe more, what does it give you?
No, I think that's right. Squidbillies had a long, painful gestation process where I think that it was just a name for the longest time. They thought we have to make this. They're all in Georgia, and like they love the name Squidbillies. They tried like 10 different incarnations of it. Nothing really worked, and they finally hit on what they ended up with. And I think it all depends on who's behind the show. Like there are plenty of shows that have a broad, ridiculous premise, and then all you get every time you tune in every week is the broad, ridiculous premise. But I think that Jim and Dave, in the case of Squidbillies in particular, Jim and Dave, the guys who run it, are just more restless than that creatively, and they wouldn't be able to go back and do the same show every week. So it's, yeah.
You mentioned drawing on your North Carolina upbringing for Squidbillies, and North Carolina here, I think people in California envision a lot of rolling hills and then sprouting out of them a lot of universities and hospitals and med schools. Like that's how they think of North Carolina. Make that picture a little more truthful for us. What is that like to grow up in?
North Carolina, I think that there's, if you watch Eastbound and Down, those guys come from North Carolina, and they do a really good job of capturing what it was like to grow up there. And Phil Morrison, another North Carolinian, made a movie called Junebug that also seemed to ring true, because it's not the Deep South, it's certainly not the North, it's some weird middle ground, and it's not the most conservative state, it's not the most liberal state. You're just sort of straight down the middle in a lot of ways. You have these enclaves of really smart people, like around Duke and UNC. So I got to grow up around genuinely talented people people like Phil, who I would see around town, and who was already sort of making a name for himself doing music videos. He went on to be a very respected director. He did those Mac ads with John Hodgman and Justin Long, and there were bands there who I didn't know were known outside of North Carolina. But like bands like Superchunk, the guys who run Merge Records. Merge has Arcade Fire, bands that are popular all over the world, but they are from North Carolina. And it was a strange place to grow up, because I wasn't necessarily looking towards New York as the place that I had to escape to. It felt like there were things going on there. Ultimately, I wanted to escape to New York, but you got a taste of you got a taste of sort of what people think of when they think of the Deep South. When I lived like way out in the country, it was certainly more. There were a lot of farms. People weren't, people typically did not go to college. Very few people would leave the small town that I was living in. And so I got to experience that sort of insular world that of a small town, but at the same time I could drive an hour away and see a show by a band that I completely respected and thought the world of, and they were living an hour away from me. Mm-hmm. So you're right in the middle of this weird kind of cultural vortex where there's so much interesting stuff and there's so much dumb stuff. it's yeah.
I would imagine, given that in that context, going off to New York is, if not a common thing to do, a known pathway. Like I don't want to stay here forever. I guess I'll go to New York. Is that an intuitive choice for the people you knew growing up there who were inclined to not stay?
Yeah, I think for me in particular, I wanted to be a comedy writer since I was like 13, but I didn't start really admitting that out loud until I was maybe a senior in college.
Well, what let you think that was a job?
I loved Saturday Night Live. I loved SCTV, and I would read everything I could get my hands on. I had this old book that was written by the writers of Late Night with David Letterman, and that was probably when I was 12 or 13, and I found it at a library sale. And I was just, there was something about it that was so magnetic to me, and I read it just cover to cover. I stared at the picture of the back of the group photo of the writers. It was just something clicked that I just thought, this is a job that it would be the best job ever. And since I always leaned more towards like the New York access of stuff. I loved Letterman and Saturday Night Live, and I was less interested in sitcoms. The one I liked, Seinfeld, was supposed to be in New York, so that I counted it as a New York show. I went out there. I had another friend who I went to UNC with, who is also working in comedy writing now, and he went out to LA. I think it really just comes down to the things that you love the most that inspired you to want to be a comedy writer, whether you go to which city you go to. But there are only two choices, so it's not that hard.
And there's only two choices, but what if anything is the sort of character difference of the comedy made in those two cities? Like, is there some sort of sensibility thing you can use to decide, or is it just like I'll go to the one doing the thing I like, and if I have to go to the other, no big deal? Or how does that work, that dynamic?
I think the stereotypes in the industry, which are it's kind of that. LA writers are, off. They're so basic that it's ridiculous to even repeat them, that they're more laid back, and that they're, and New York writers tend to be, come from stand up. They have some performer background in performance, and they're, edgier. I had a friend who worked, at a show that was kind of struggling, and, the host's solution was to bring in some edgy New York comedy guys. Those were his words. And so it's completely meaningless. It just means, buying someone a plane ticket, because most of those guys are out here now anyway. But I feel like you can't help but be affected by the sort of pressure cooker environment that New York City is, and that informs your personality. Comedy writers a lot of the time tend to be more anxious and sometimes depressive people. And when you put them in a pressure cooker like New York, they're going to be more anxious and more depressed. That could result in comedy that it seems edgier. And in LA, if you're making a sitcom salary and you're driving around, you're driving to Santa Barbara on the weekend, you're probably going to be more relaxed. At the same time, Tim and Eric are in LA, and I think it doesn't really get much edgier than Tim and Eric.
Right.
So there are a lot of exceptions.
Do you ever miss that kind of loving hatred, loving misery that New York seemed to offer? I mean, it sounds unpleasant, but did it give any energy that you could use?
It did. It did inspire me to keep working, even though I almost gave up at one point right before I got hired. It did make me feel like I have to earn my keep here. I can't just kind of roll over because things have gotten hard. You sort of get infused with the energy of the city, which is just people constantly pushing forward. Like people who work at supermarkets in New York tend to be angry and impolite to you. When I came to LA, it was very strange going to a supermarket and having somebody seem like genuinely cheery while she or he rang me up. And I think it's just because everyone in New York feels that. Everyone feels like they should be pushing forward and going further. And if you're not there yet, then you're not entirely in the moment. You're always thinking what the next step's going to be. That's the way I was, and maybe I'm just projecting, but I don't feel that way out here nearly as much, even though there's some energy of that. You look around and you see people who are not making it in LA, and you don't want to be those people because, yeah.
But there's a sense here of that people I talk to, at least the writers and people working in film and television, they always want to get the next thing going, don't they? Like there's that spirit, which is not the same thing as always pushing for the next level in New York. Or I guess I want to make sure people know what distinction you're drawing between those.
I think that the distinction in New York, it's less career based. It's more kind of your whole personality. You feel like personally you're a failure in New York unless you're really achieving as much as you can possibly achieve. I think that the people who end up in show business generally are always going to be the more ambitious people. The people who succeed and move forward are always going to be ambitious. They're always going to be looking for the next project. But I just feel like the people I've worked with here just don't have that kind of manic energy that a lot of the people I worked with in New York had. And it's strange seeing, I have a lot of friends on the Conan writing staff. And I always idolized those guys when I was in college. I don't know if he started when I was in high school, but I remember that was another show that I was on board from the very beginning. But they always had the most charismatic and brilliant writers, these guys who seemed to be as good at performing as they were at writing. I always associated that. I always thought of that as a very New York thing. These people who are just such complicated personalities and who have found a way to package it in a way that's palatable on something like an NBC late night show. And I always thought of LA writers as these kind of guys pushing middle age with families, and they were like tenured at some like Friends type show where they weren't necessarily creatively fulfilled. They were kind of I always thought of them as like craftsmen, people who are good at like shaping stories more than they were at they were better at that than they were at writing jokes and being like what I always thought of, which was like informed by Saturday Night Live writers and Conan writers, as those just genuinely funny people who would just produce these kind of nuggets of comedy out of nowhere. It seemed like you were hanging jokes on a template for sitcom writing, and for something like Conan, you're creating things out of just whole cloth. you're doing just standalone bits and characters, and you had to do it night after night. And I respected that more. I've since learned that is a very oversimplified view of the difference between LA and New York writers, but I probably somewhere deep down that informs the way I think of the two. You know.
Now, Conan O'Brien in the shows he's had, that it seems like he's such a common icon for comedy people from the age of 25 to 40 or so right now. Like they saw what Conan O'Brien was doing, they latched onto it, they watched it, they learned from it, and that tapped into a comedic well within them that these people inspired by Conan O'Brien have used in their careers. Like what is, how do you describe that vein of comedy that his shows have mined, and that so many comedy writers have gone on to in their own way mine after latching on to his stuff? Like what is this? Is there a Conanness that has shaped this generation of comedy writers?
Absolutely. I think it has to do with moving away from. It has to do with moving into like pure silliness, away from satire, away from something that was supposed to have a point. And a lot of the time, if like the real geniuses of that world, like Conan and like Robert Smigel is probably as responsible for it as Conan, because he was the first head writer there, and a lot of his sensibility is still there in Conan's show. Smigel in particular, about Smigel, he started out at Saturday Night Live, and he was doing more satirical sketches. He did that famous sketch where behind closed doors, Ronald Reagan is like a mastermind. Do you remember that one? Yeah. And that's such a pointed political sketch, and it doesn't really seem like the Smigel that I kind of first idolized. Like when I saw like TV Funhouse and his Comedy Central version of TV Funhouse, and that Smigel is sort of like he did The Ex-Presidents, which was just taking political figures, taking something that it usually, if it was handled by like a comedian or a satirist, there would be some sort of political point to it. Just doing something completely silly with them, you know. I think there was just this sort of liberating. It was almost like a movement in comedy that, like, definitely David Letterman kickstarted, just because.
Better to say a Lettermanness than a Conanness.
Yeah, that's the thing. Whenever I start talking about Conan, I have to trace it back to Letterman, and Letterman would trace it back to Ernie Kovacs. And I think it's just this vein of silliness, like really smart people doing really stupid things. I think that's kind of the crux of a lot of what Conan does. It's this incredible brain trust of dudes who went to Harvard, and they're all together in a room, and they're coming up with like the masturbating bear and there's something that's just so satisfying about that. So, and in a way, frustrated, because they could be doing things so much more, but you're almost grateful to them for taking all their energy and all their brain power and focusing on making something stupid that makes you laugh. It's still present, and I think it went from there to Tim and Eric, who I always I equate like Bob Odenkirk and Rob Smigel as these two twin like geniuses of comedy who were working around the same time. Smigel was sort of more mainstream. He was doing stuff that you could show on Saturday Night Live, and Odenkirk would kind of push it further in the direction of like whatever alt comedy is, whatever, basically stuff that you could only really show late at night on HBO. Right. But they were working on sort of parallel paths to me. And I think those guys, like Tim and Eric, came out of that. It seems like it's from Letterman to Conan to Tim and Eric. It's been the same basic idea of smart people doing stupid things, but just pushed a little further and presented in different ways. And
strangely remains inspiring.
Yeah, it does. That's the thing about comedy writing, is that you're doing the same trick again and again and again. And if you can find a way to make yourself laugh after years of trying to come up with jokes, mostly on the same subjects, then it's just magical. It just feels like you've really, like, you remember why you're doing it. And that's what I love so much about someone like Tim and Eric, when they showed up, and I didn't realize that there was a new way to make people laugh using the same basic ingredient, the same basic tools. Like, I never would have suspected that there could be something that was so original. Because every once in a while you want to get lazy and just think, everything's been done, and I'll just work within this sort of this framework that's already been built for me. And then when there's something else that comes out after Tim and Eric, there's always something new. There's always something more, and it usually just comes from geniuses, just with brilliant personalities, interpreting the same sort of crap that everyone else has been, consuming for generations.
I've been speaking in Atwater Village with comedy writer Scott Jacobson, whom you may know from the music videos he's directed. You may know him from writing on The Daily Show. You may know his contributions to Squidbillies or to Bob's Burgers or to any number of projects. Also, the book I didn't mention, Sex, Our Bodies, Our Junk. He's a member of the Pleasure Syndicate, in case you didn't know about that. But Scott, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Colin.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Nullman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Umberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McKelmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.